Just a nurse. That's what they called her in the hallways of Oak Creek Memorial, if they called her anything at all. Danielle Ross moved through the corridors of the Raleigh hospital like someone who understood the weight of silence, who had learned long ago that invisibility was a kind of armor. 6 months into her civilian assignment, and it was an assignment, though no one knew that except the Navy officer who checked in on her every 90 days, she had perfected the art of disappearing into beige walls and fluorescent hum. She did her job. She did it well. And she kept her head down because those were her orders. Oak Creek Memorial smelled like bleach and burnt coffee, that particular combination of institutional cleanliness and human exhaustion that seemed to permeate every American hospital built after 1985. The linoleum floors clicked under her nursing clogs, white, practical, unremarkable, and the ventilator in room 312 wheezed its mechanical rhythm somewhere down the east wing. Danielle had learned to use hospital sounds like sonar, her attention distributed across a dozen monitors and alarms simultaneously, the way a combat field surgeon learns to triage by listening to what isn't being said. She stood outside the staff lounge at 6:53 a.m., before the morning shift officially began, watching the coffee machine spit out what might generously be called coffee. Her uniform was regulation scrubs, navy blue, pockets containing exactly what they should contain, 2 pens, a penlight, trauma shears she'd owned for 18 years. The scrubs hung loose on her frame. She weighed 143 pounds, all of it muscle and scar tissue and the kind of lean that comes from running in 120-degree heat while carrying equipment that weighs more than a grown man. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, a deliberate choice. The long sleeve stayed on during her shifts. Her forearms bore evidence of decisions made in operating theaters that officially never existed. 7 surgical scars, each one a story she would never tell. A shrapnel wound from Sanjin Valley that had required 13 stitches. A laceration from a door frame during an emergency evacuation from FOB Shank. The scars crisscrossed in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, like her body was a classified map that no one was supposed to read. When she was alone in her apartment at night, Danielle would trace them with her right hand. The tremor came then, when no one was watching, a slight shake that her commanding officers had classified as service-related involuntary response and filed away in a locked cabinet in the Pentagon basement. Room 304 was on the 2nd floor, south wing, a private room overlooking a parking lot where rain had started to fall in that soft, insistent way that suggested it was planning to stay all day. Captain Michael Chen lay in the hospital bed with his eyes fixed on the ceiling tile, and Danielle's breath caught for exactly 2/3 of a second before she controlled it. Not a breath, not really, something smaller, something she could hide in the machinery of routine hospital work. His left forearm rested above the sheet. Block letters. Military tattoo. Her name. Not her given name, not the name that appeared on her civilian driver's license, but the name the Navy had given her in 2007, the name she'd worn for 16 years like a second uniform, the name that belonged to a woman who no longer officially existed. She had pulled Michael Chen's bleeding body through Tikrit in 2011, 3 miles under heavy mortar fire, and he had called her name because that's what soldiers do when they're dying, they call for the one person they believe might save them. She had. The bleeding had stopped. His heart had kept beating. 6 months ago, she hadn't expected him to walk back into her life through a hospital door marked room 304. He didn't recognize her. His eyes were polite and empty, the eyes of a man recovering from a stroke, and when she entered his room with his morning medications, he looked at her the way he might look at any member of the nursing staff. "How are we feeling this morning, Captain?" she asked, her voice keeping its carefully modulated tone, a voice designed to convey competence without authority, concern without connection. She set his pills on the bedside table with 2 fingers and a practice motion, diuretic for the fluid retention, blood thinner to prevent further clots, a statin for the cholesterol that had likely contributed to the stroke in the first place. "Tired," Captain Chen said, and his voice was a rasp. 3 letters, 2 syllables. Everything feels like it's underwater. She adjusted his full line without looking at his face. The hand moved on its own, muscle memory, the kind of competence that came from having done this procedure in field hospitals lit by generator light and in trauma bays where the floor was slick with blood. That's normal. The brain is rewiring itself. Takes time. She was out of his room in 47 seconds. She knew this because she had timed it. She had timed everything since she arrived at Oak Creek Memorial, the way a soldier times exits and entry points, the way someone times how long it takes to disappear. The hospital hierarchy was as rigid as any military chain of command, and Dr. Harrison Hargrove occupied the apex. He was a senior attending cardiologist with 19 years at Oak Creek, a man whose family money and family connections had liquefied into genuine institutional influence. His father had been a federal judge. His mother's maiden name appeared on a building in the hospital's main atrium. When Dr. Hargrove walked through the corridors, people moved. Residents scattered like birds. Nurses suddenly found urgent business in other rooms. He carried himself like a man who had never been told no, and his voice had the texture of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. Danielle had registered him during her second day on the job. The way he moved, a man used to control, used to hierarchy, used to being the smartest person in any room. The way he looked at staff members who challenged him with an expression like they had committed a personal betrayal. The way he seemed to catalogue weakness in people the way a predator catalogues prey. These were things she understood. She had served under commanders who carried the same particular brand of authority, and she had learned to navigate their territories without incident. What she did not expect was Dr. Hargrove's attention. His eyes found her 3 weeks into her employment, on a Tuesday morning outside the nurse's station, and he paused in a way that suggested he was seeing something. Danielle felt the weight of his observation the way a prey animal feels the weight of a larger animal's gaze, a shift in air pressure, a change in room temperature, a predatory interest that shifted something fundamental in the space between them. "You," he said, pointing with 2 fingers, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that suggested the word was more of an order than a greeting. "Come here." She went. Of course she went. She had spent 16 years learning to move toward authority, to respond to direct commands, to understand that hesitation was a weakness that got people killed. Her feet carried her across the beige linoleum, her hand settling naturally at her sides, her face arranged in an expression of neutral attentiveness. The training was so deep now that it didn't feel like training anymore. It felt like truth. "What's your name?" Dr. Hargrove asked. His eyes were moving across her face with a kind of clinical assessment, as though she were a patient case study. She was somewhere in her late 30s, he was thinking, maybe younger, maybe older. It was difficult to say because her face had very little expression on it, as though she had learned to keep everything locked down behind her eyes. "Danielle Ross," she said. Her voice was steady. Quiet. The kind of voice that people often had to lean in to hear, which was useful because it prevented them from noticing that the words themselves were economical, stripped of effect. "RN, 6 months with the hospital. You came from?" He was already losing interest, she realized. The initial spike of his attention was already fading, and she understood that whatever he had been cataloguing in her face, he had decided it was not of particular importance. "Naval Medical Center San Diego," she said. This was technically true, and it was the kind of truth that contained so many layers of actual truth beneath it that it qualified as the absolute best kind of lie. "Transferred for personal reasons." He nodded, already turning away, already moving on to the next thing that required his attention. "Fine. You'll assist during the Chen case rounds. Cardiologists' orders take precedence. Don't bother me with questions I've already answered." "Understood," she said. She watched him move down the corridor, his white coat trailing behind him like the wake of a ship, and she understood several things in that moment with the kind of clarity that came from having made these observations in other contexts, other corridors, other lives. First, he had noticed something in her that was not normal, something in her posture, perhaps, or the precise way she held her shoulders, or maybe just the fact that she had not flinched or qualified her response with any of the linguistic softening that women were trained to provide. Second, he had not recognized what he was seeing, which meant he did not have the context for it. Third, he would be watching her now, because weakness and inexplicable competence in the same person seemed like a contradiction worth investigating. The rain outside began to hammer the windows in that particular way that made you understand the sky was not taking any requests. The rain hammered the windows in that particular way that made you understand the sky was not taking any requests. Danielle stood at the staff lounge entrance the next morning, holding a lukewarm coffee in a styrofoam cup, when Dr. Hargrove's voice cut through the hallway like a scalpel finding bone. "I give you a week before you quit," he announced, loud enough for the surgical team visible through the open doorway to hear every syllable. $100 says you're gone by Friday. What do you think, Stevens? 3 days. Laughter rippled from inside the lounge. Smooth. Practiced. The kind of laughter that had been greased by 6 months of watching her scrubs, her hands, the way she moved through Oak Creek Memorial like someone who belonged in operating rooms but somehow ended up changing bedpans. Danielle took one measured breath. Her jaw tightened, not visibly, just enough that only she felt the tendons flex. She maintained eye contact with Dr. Hargrove for exactly 3 seconds, the kind of stare that should have made a lesser man uncomfortable. It didn't. His smile widened. "I've outlasted worse bets, Doctor," she said quietly. She turned and walked toward the medication room. Behind her, she heard Stevens ask, "What's her deal anyway?" and Hargrove's reply, "Nobody knows." That's what makes it interesting. By the next shift, he had given her a nickname. Nightingale. It hung in the air like a toxin. He used it in charting meetings. "Nightingale, can you verify these vitals?" With mockery dripping from every syllable like poison from a snake's fangs. He used it in front of patients, voice syrupy sweet, "Don't worry, our Nightingale here will get you some water." He deployed it at shift changes when she passed him in the corridor. "Nightingale, looking tired today. Everything all right at home?" The name was a weapon because it sounded gentle on the surface. A nightingale sang. A nightingale healed. A nightingale was small, decorative, something you tolerated for its pretty voice and nothing else. The surgical team began using it too, echoing his intonation, testing whether she would flinch. She didn't. She recorded vitals, updated charts, moved between patient rooms with the precision of someone who had performed far more complex tasks under far more lethal circumstances. 2 days later, Hargrove found her in the cafeteria. She sat alone at a corner table, pushing pasta around a plate she wasn't tasting. He approached while speaking animatedly to Dr. Reeves, a resident half his age, gesturing broadly with both hands, his elbow angled in that particular way that looked accidental to everyone but her. She saw it coming. Her body registered the trajectory before her conscious mind could order her hands to move the tray. The collision happened anyway. Coffee splashed across her scrubs, down her legs, soaking into the cotton, the heat of it shocking against her skin. Pasta scattered across the floor like confetti at a funeral. The cafeteria went quiet. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. 73 people watching the same moment of deliberate humiliation. "Oh, Nightingale," Dr. Hargrove said, his voice dripping with false concern. "So clumsy. Maybe you need some rest? You're making mistakes." Danielle stood slowly. Coffee dripped from her legs. She could smell it, bitter, burnt, acidic. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that particular frequency that made the back of your skull ache after 12 hours. She looked at Dr. Hargrove with the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst the world could offer. One tear escaped down her left cheek. She didn't stop it. She didn't try to hide it. She simply wiped it away with the back of her hand while maintaining complete, unwavering eye contact. "Clumsiness is forgivable, Doctor," she said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "Cruelty isn't." She walked to the supply closet, changed into her backup scrubs, and returned to her assigned patients. The cafeteria remained silent for 47 seconds after she left. Someone finally dropped a fork. The spell broke. That evening, Hargrove made the first of several phone calls. The hospital board president answered his cell at 8:41 p.m. while cooking dinner. "Just concerned about some performance inconsistencies," Hargrove said, voice warm with professional worry. "Questions about her credentials, really. She's very quiet, very. I don't know, mysterious." Background doesn't quite add up. 3 days later, during morning rounds, Danielle stood at the foot of Captain Chen's bed, reviewing his chart. The morning light slanted through the window, illuminating the grey at his temples, the oxygen cannula under his nose, the way his eyes tracked movement in the room without quite focusing. Hargrove approached the group of 4 residents and 2 nurses gathered in the doorway. He took Captain Chen's chart from Danielle's hands and threw it. Not dropped. Threw. The paper scattered across the tile floor in a way that seemed to mock gravity itself. They spread like a confession that had never been meant to be heard. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Dr. Hargrove said, voice dripping honey. "That's more your speed than actual medicine." The surgical team exchanged glances. One resident looked away. Another appeared to be counting floor tiles. Nurse Martina stared at a point on the wall that required her complete attention. Captain Chen watched from his bed, his eyes narrowing with something that looked like a memory trying to surface, his gaze fixed on Danielle's face as if he was staring at a photograph of someone he should have known in another lifetime. Danielle knelt slowly, her movements precise and controlled, the kind of deliberation that turned a humiliating moment into something else, something closer to a demonstration of discipline. She gathered the papers, organizing them by page number, her hands moving with the competence of someone who had performed far more complex tasks under far more lethal circumstances. She stood and handed the chart back to Dr. Hargrove. "I've carried heavier things than your ego, Doctor." His face darkened. The vein at his temple pulsed. For a moment, something dangerous flickered behind his eyes, the expression of a man who had just realized that his weapon wasn't working the way he expected. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even the beginning of what was coming. That evening, Danielle overheard fragments of conversation in the hallway outside the medication room. Her supervisor speaking with the interim department director, background doesn't add up, only 6 months of verifiable civilian experience, no military service on file, complete ghost before last year. The supply room door opened and Nurse Patterson leaned against the shelving, watching her organize for bags. "What were you doing before Oak Creek?" Patterson asked, casual as someone asking about the weather. Danielle's hand trembled, not from fear but from the effort of maintaining restraint, of keeping something locked down that had been trained to recognize threats and respond with immediate, overwhelming force. She reached for gauze, her fingers steady by the time she withdrew them. Moving around, she said quietly, "Temp work." Patterson's expression didn't shift, but her silence suggested skepticism. She turned and left. Danielle stood alone between the boxes of supplies, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and sterile packaging, her jaw clenched so tightly she could taste copper. Captain Chen's condition fluctuated over the next 72 hours. Stable in the morning, declining by afternoon, stable again by evening. Danielle noticed it during her break shifts, standing at his bedside, observing the subtle signs the on-call resident kept missing, the way his breathing pattern changed, the faint wheeze that suggested fluid accumulation, the cardiac rhythm that was beginning to skip like a faulty metronome. She mentioned it twice to the attending physician. Both times, Hargrove dismissed her in front of witnesses. "Stick to bedpans, Nightingale. The doctors will handle diagnostics." That night, after her shift ended at 11:56 p.m., Danielle stood in the hospital parking lot under the sodium lights that made everything look like it had already died. Rain fell in sheets. Thunder rolled across Raleigh like the sound of distant artillery, a noise that made her spine straighten, her breathing deepen, her hands instinctively check for equipment that no longer existed. She reached into her jacket lining and withdrew the faded unit patch, the embroidered symbol worn smooth by fingers, the edges frayed from years of being carried close to skin. She ran her thumb over the thread, following the outline of the insignia, the crest she had earned through 3 tours and 4 field hospitals and decisions made in the dark that had consequences no paperwork could ever capture. She couldn't use it. She couldn't explain. She was Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, or rather, she had been. After Tikrit, after the classified operation that was officially buried, after 16 sailors died and an investigation determined that certain details could never be allowed to surface, naval intelligence had made a decision. Her records were erased. Her service became a ghost. She was told to disappear into civilian life, to become no one, to walk among ordinary people as though she had always been ordinary. She put the patch back in her pocket. The next morning, Danielle arrived at Oak Creek Memorial to find that Dr. Hargrove had begun making calls to her references from the temp agency, probing for gaps in employment history, asking why a nurse her age had only 6 months of verifiable civilian experience, requesting clarification on dates that didn't quite align with her official record. An outside investigator had been brought in to review every chart she'd touched, looking for documentation errors, scope violations, anything that could be weaponized. The hospital board was scheduled to meet in 4 days. But that wasn't the worst part. Captain Chen's heart was filling with fluid. And the only person at Oak Creek Memorial who could hear the difference between his normal heartbeat and the sound of a man drowning in his own blood was the one person no one was allowed to believe. The monitor screamed at 2:07 a.m. Not the soft beep of a normal rhythm. The shriek of a flat line, high and desperate and wrong, echoing down the darkened 4th-floor corridor of Oak Creek Memorial like an animal in a trap. Danielle was passing Captain Chen's room when the alarm tore through the darkness, her body already moving before her mind caught up, muscle memory older than her civilian name pulling her toward the sound. She hit the doorway hard. Chen's chest heaved in that terrible way that meant drowning from the inside. His lips had turned the color of slate. His eyes rolled back, searching for oxygen that wasn't there. The on-call resident, Kessler, maybe, some 3rd year who smelled like energy drinks and panic, stood at the foot of the bed with his hands frozen at his sides. His mouth moved. Words came out but they weren't words, just sounds, consonants without meaning. "Get Dr. Hargrove," the resident finally managed. I should call, we need the attending." Danielle didn't respond. She was reading the monitor. Reading the flat line. Reading the man in the bed whose forearm bore the name she'd worn for 16 years in places where names meant target coordinates and target coordinates meant death. Oxygen sat dropping. 98. 94. 89. Chen's hand clawed at his chest like he could tear the fluid out himself. Danielle knew what was happening. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid compressing his heart, squeezing it smaller with every breath he couldn't take. Not a stroke complication. A post-operative pericardial effusion nobody had caught. Nobody had listened to closely enough. She had 90 seconds. "Step back," she said to the resident. "I can't authorize, you're not." The crash cart was 3 steps away. Danielle moved like water, smooth and inevitable, her hands finding the pericardiocentesis kit by muscle memory alone. 18-gauge needle. Syringe. Iodine swab. The resident was still talking behind her, his voice rising into something that might have been protest or might have been prayer. She swabbed Chen's chest with iodine in 3 efficient strokes. The smell of it, sharp, chemical, the smell of operating theaters in Tikrit and Sanjin and Ulquayim, the smell of hands that had held lives together in the dark, filled the room like a ghost materializing. The needle went in below the xiphoid process, angled toward his left shoulder at a 45-degree angle. Not hesitation. Not doubt. Not the trembling hands of someone about to commit a career violation. Just precision. Just the thing her body had learned to do when the only alternative was letting someone die. Dark fluid rushed into the syringe. 50 milliliters of blood-tinged pericardial fluid that had been crushing Captain Michael Chen's heart into something smaller than a fist. His chest expanded. His lungs found air. His eyes snapped open and locked on hers for exactly 1 second, and in that second his hand reached up and his fingers brushed her wrist, and she felt the recognition kindle in his eyes like a match striking in the dark, and then it faded. His pupils dilated. His consciousness retreated. His hand fell. But that was enough. The syringe in her hand held 50 milliliters of proof that she'd been trained to do something the hospital had no authority to have her do. The monitor beeped a normal rhythm. Chen's oxygen climbed. 88. 92. 96. Danielle set the syringe down on the sterile field with the kind of care you'd use handling something made of glass. Dr. Hargrove arrived at 4 minutes and 37 seconds past the alarm. She could hear him coming before she saw him, the particular rhythm of his footsteps, that particular velocity of a man moving through his own kingdom. He stopped in the doorway and his eyes catalogued the scene the way a prosecutor catalogues a crime scene. The crash cart. The open procedure kit. Danielle standing there in her scrubs with her hands at her sides and the residue of iodine still darkening her gloved fingers. Chen's chest rose and fell. Normal. Steady. Alive. Hargrove's expression moved through several phases. Shock. Disbelief. And then something that looked almost like satisfaction, the way a man might look if you'd just handed him exactly what he needed to burn your life to the ground. What the hell have you done? His voice had that particular timbre now, the public voice, the voice that made sure every word traveled down the hallway to the nursing station and beyond. The resident started explaining, stammering through the sequence of events, but Hargrove cut him off with a gesture that could have sliced steel. She performed a pericardiocentesis without supervision. Without authorization. Do you understand what you've just given me? Hargrove's eyes never left her face. He was looking for something, a flinch, a tremor, the physiological signature of fear. A scope violation. Practicing medicine without a license. I have 3 witnesses now. The monitor. The equipment. This patient's chart, which is going to show exactly who was here and what you did. Danielle said nothing. There was nothing to say. The pericardial fluid was still in the syringe. The monitor was still beeping. Captain Chen was still breathing. And somewhere in this hospital, on his desk or in his office, Dr. Hargrove had been building a file. Making calls. Doing the work of a man who'd discovered a loose thread and had decided to pull it until something unraveled. The investigator reviewing her charts. The references he'd called digging for employment gaps. The personnel folder that now had a new entry, unauthorized procedure. Scope violation. Practicing beyond credentials. She saved his life, sir, the resident said quietly. She violated hospital policy. That's what I see. That's what a lawyer sees. That's what the board will see. Hargrove stepped closer to the monitor, reading it with the expression of someone admiring a particularly fine piece of evidence. Get her a witness statement form. Get 2 more staff members in here to document this scene. And get Danielle Ross to the administrator's office at 6 a.m. We're done here. Danielle didn't move. Didn't speak. The silence in the room had that particular quality it gets when something irrevocable has just occurred, when a line has been crossed and the bridge burned behind you, when the only thing left is to see how far the smoke travels. Her jacket was in her locker. In the pocket of her jacket was a faded unit patch sewn into the lining, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, 3 letters worn nearly invisible by 16 years of fingertips finding it in the dark, reminding her of who she'd been before she became no one. That patch could not help her now. That rank could not help her now. The orders that had sent her into civilian life with a false name and a fabricated employment history could not help her now. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that in exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes, she would be terminated. Escorted from the building. Her nursing license would be under review. The Pentagon would activate Protocol 77 Charlie, the classification that erased her service record and ordered her deeper into invisibility. And Captain Michael Chen would remember none of this. He would open his eyes tomorrow and see a Navy nurse he'd never met, a woman who'd been trained in surgical theaters he'd never known existed, who'd carried his blood on her hands in countries whose names she couldn't speak aloud. He would never know that Danielle Ross, or whatever her name actually was, had done what she did not once but twice, first in Tikrit, dragging his bleeding body 3 miles while mortars fell like rain, and second in Raleigh, in a room that smelled of iodine and fluorescent lights, inserting a needle into his chest because some codes transcend authorization and some lines of duty are written in places that no hospital administrator would ever understand. The resident was still standing there, watching her. Kessler. His name tag read Kessler. His eyes had something in them now, recognition, maybe, or the dawning realization that he'd just watched a woman violate every rule of institutional medicine and save a man's life in exactly the same moment, and that these two truths would never reconcile in any official record. "You should go," Danielle said. 10 words or fewer. The voice perfectly level. The voice of someone who'd already lived through worse and was about to live through worse again and would not, under any circumstance, give any of them the satisfaction of breaking. Kessler left. Hargrove followed, his footsteps receding down the corridor with the particular rhythm of a man who'd just been given everything he needed. The monitor beeped. Chen's oxygen held steady at 97%. The pericardial fluid, 50 milliliters of proof, sat in its syringe-like evidence in a trial that would never be heard by a jury that would ever understand what it meant. Danielle looked at her hands. Iodine-stained. Steady. Hands that had held lives together in places where rank and authorization meant nothing against the simple physics of human survival. She'd crossed a line. She'd known she was crossing it before the needle went in. And she'd do it again. That was the part that Hargrove, with all his investigation and his network and his files, would never understand. The part that existed in spaces his authority could not reach. The part that lived in the scar tissue of people who'd learned that sometimes there is no choice, only the choice to act or to watch someone die while you follow the rules. The monitor kept its rhythm. Captain Chen's chest rose and fell. His hand, the one with her name tattooed in block letters on the forearm, lay quiet on the bedsheet. At 6 a.m., she would walk into an administrator's office and hear words like termination and violation and legal. But for now, in the darkness of a hospital room where a man she'd saved twice in 2 different wars was breathing because she'd broken every rule that mattered and followed the only rule that ever did, Danielle Ross stood perfectly still and waited for the future to arrive. The fluorescent lights flickered above the administrative hallway. Danielle could hear them even through the closed office door, that particular frequency that only certain ears notice, the ones trained to detect warning signals in the dark. It was 6:30 in the morning. Dr. Hargrove was already on his phone, his voice carrying through the walls like a command frequency cutting through static. She knew what was happening. She'd seen this pattern before, in interrogation rooms and command centers, the systematic dismantling of a threat. Hargrove was calling the hospital board president at home, his tone urgent, practiced. "We have a serious credentialing concern," he was saying. "Patient endangerment. An unauthorized surgical procedure performed by a registered nurse with no supervision, no attending physician present. I witnessed it myself." Each word was a precision strike. Each sentence built a foundation that would hold up in depositions. Danielle sat in the break room, still wearing her scrubs from the night shift, and waited. She could wait. She'd learned how to wait in places where waiting meant staying alive. The coffee in her cup had gone cold an hour ago. She didn't drink it. By 7:15, Hargrove was calling her references. The ones she'd listed on her Oak Creek Memorial employment application, the civilian ones, the clean ones. Her previous supervisor at a clinic in Durham, her credentials verifier through the North Carolina Board of Nursing, her background check provider. He was asking questions with the precision of a surgeon looking for a single cell out of place. Employment gaps? Discrepancies in dates? Why had she moved 3 times in 18 months? Why were there 6 months of unaccounted time in 2019? The gaps were there because they had to be there. Naval intelligence had erased them. They'd scrubbed her record clean when the operation in Tikrit went sideways and 16 sailors died under her hands, not from her actions, but from the crossfire and the blast radius of the IED that took out the convoy. The Pentagon had made her disappear because some operations never happened. Some casualties never existed in any official database. Some nurses with combat training who'd led field surgical teams in combat zones got sent back to civilian life with new names and empty personnel files and explicit orders to vanish. She couldn't explain any of that to a hospital administrator. By 9 o'clock, an outside investigator was sitting in a conference room on the 3rd floor, reviewing every single medical chart Danielle had touched during her 6 months at Oak Creek Memorial. 173 patient encounters. Every note she'd written, every vital sign she'd documented, every medication she'd administered under a licensed physician's orders. He was looking for inconsistencies, for evidence of medical knowledge that exceeded her credential level, for signs that she was practicing as a physician instead of a nurse. The investigator wouldn't find anything. Every single chart was flawless. Every intervention was within scope. Every documentation was precise and accurate, which was its own kind of problem, because Hargrove would argue that no nurse who'd been at Oak Creek for 6 months should be this meticulous, this confident, this capable of recognizing subtle pathology before senior physicians even noticed it was there. At 10:45, Danielle was summoned to the administrative office. The HR director was waiting with 2 other people, the hospital's legal counsel and Hargrove, standing in the corner like a vulture that had already picked the bones clean. The HR director, a woman named Chen, no relation to the captain, wouldn't meet her eyes. That was always the sign. When administrators couldn't look you in the face, it meant the decision was already final and the conversation was just theater. "We're terminating your employment effective immediately," Margaret said, her voice like something recording from a distance. "For practicing beyond the scope of your licensure without direct supervision. A preliminary investigation has found credentialing concerns and inconsistencies in your background materials." Danielle heard the words the way she heard alarm bells in trauma bays, as data, as information, as something that required a response but not an emotional one. She'd trained herself not to feel this kind of threat. Pain was information. Humiliation was information. Loss was information. "The patient," she asked. "Captain Chen is stable," Margaret said. "But that's not relevant to this decision. What's relevant is that you performed an invasive surgical procedure without the direct authorization of an attending physician." "I performed an emergency life-saving intervention on a patient in cardiac arrest." "Exactly," Hargrove said from the corner. His voice was smooth, satisfied. "Beyond your scope. And we have no way to verify your actual qualifications because your background materials contain significant gaps and inconsistencies." Danielle didn't respond. There was nothing to say. She couldn't tell them that she'd performed that same procedure 300 times in 3 different countries. She couldn't explain that her hands knew how to read a chest wall by touch, how to locate the pericardial sac by memory, how to draw fluid from around a failing heart while mortars fell in Tikrit. She couldn't tell them that the gaps in her employment history weren't inconsistencies, they were classified operations that never officially happened. Margaret slid a termination letter across the desk. Danielle signed it with the same steady hand that had saved Captain Chen's life 6 hours earlier. The signature was as precise as her medical documentation had been. As controlled. As untouched by anything resembling fear or anger or desperation. Security escorted her to her locker at 11:30. She retrieved her jacket, a simple navy windbreaker with a faded unit patch sewn into the inside lining, tiny enough that no one would notice unless they were looking for it. She took her stethoscope, the one with her initials scratched into the earpieces. A photograph of a Humvee burning in the desert, the image grainy and sun-bleached, taken by someone who shouldn't have had a camera in their hands but couldn't help documenting proof that they'd been there. Hargrove watched from the hallway as she walked toward the main exit. She could feel his satisfaction the way you feel heat radiating off asphalt. Security walked her past the nurse's station, where whispers started before she reached the double doors. Just a nurse who'd overstepped. Just someone who'd thought she knew better than the doctors. Just another cautionary tale about staying in your lane. Danielle Ross had saved lives in 5 countries. She'd led surgical teams through mortar fire. She'd restarted the heart of a Navy captain with her hands alone, 3 miles from the nearest military base, while IED blasts shook the ground around them. And now she was being walked out of a hospital in Raleigh like someone who didn't know the difference between a nurse's scope and a physician's license. 3 days later, she sat in a VA hospital waiting room as a patient. The chairs were cracked plastic, worn to a shine by years of veterans waiting for appointments, waiting for pain management, waiting for someone to tell them that the nightmares would eventually decrease in frequency if not in intensity. The air smelled like institutional disinfectant trying to mask the smell of old coffee and something deeper, the particular staleness of hope deferred. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the sound of insects in a jar. Around her sat men and women she recognized. Not by name, those names she could never speak aloud, but by the specific angle of their scars, the way they moved when the pain spiked, the 1,000-yard stare that belonged exclusively to people who'd seen things that didn't fit inside normal consciousness. A double amputee in a wheelchair. A woman whose left arm ended at the wrist, tattoo of a marine insignia still visible on the remaining forearm. An older man whose left eye was milky with scar tissue. She'd treated their wounds in field hospitals in Kandahar and Fallujah and places without names. She'd held their hands while sepsis claimed their fingers. She'd documented their vital signs on clipboards held against her chest while mortar fire shook the canvas walls. She'd saved some of them twice. They didn't recognize her now. She was just another veteran waiting for her appointment, just another person whose body had decided to stop working correctly. The intake form in her lap asked about service-connected disabilities. It asked about combat exposure. It asked for details about where and when. She filled it out in the same careful handwriting she'd used for 6 months at Oak Creek Memorial, each letter precise and controlled and revealing nothing. A nurse called her name, her civilian name, the one that had been given to her when she was ordered to disappear. Danielle stood, gathered her forms, and walked through the door. The waiting room had been full of people whose wounds she'd once treated, whose lives she'd saved in the dark with inadequate equipment and steady hands. They'd stared through her as if she didn't exist. Which was exactly what she'd been ordered to do. Disappear. Become no one. Carry the secret in her bones and pretend it never happened. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Captain Michael Chen was somewhere in this building right now, recovering from his stroke in a rehabilitation unit 3 floors above her, breathing because she'd broken every rule that mattered and followed the only rule that ever did. And she would walk past his door eventually. They worked in the same hospital system now, him as a recovering patient, her as a broken veteran. Their paths would cross again. When they did, she had no idea what would happen. Captain Chen was transferred to the VA hospital for rehabilitation 3 days after Danielle's termination, and when she walked past his room on her 3rd visit as a patient, not staff, just another body moving through corridors that used to know her name, his eyes suddenly focused with clarity they hadn't held in weeks. The machines around his bed beat their steady rhythm as recognition moved across his face like storm clouds breaking. He whispered a single word, Valkyrie. His voice was barely audible, rough from disuse, but it carried the weight of 2 years compressed into 1 syllable. She stopped. She didn't turn. She kept walking because there were protocols, because there were secrets still classified, because some debts had to be paid in silence. But her hands had gone cold. His daughter arrived within the hour, and she was waiting outside his room when Danielle passed a second time. The resemblance was immediate, the same jawline, the same direct gaze, the same military bearing that no amount of illness could soften. The daughter stared at her with eyes that had pieced something together, and her voice came out steady and certain, "You're a senior chief petty officer, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. It was recognition, the kind that came from studying old photographs and military records and asking her father questions that made him weep. Danielle didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence was confirmation enough, and the daughter's face shifted, not with shock, but with understanding. The weight her father carried had a name, and that name wore scrubs and kept her eyes forward. A Navy nurse appeared at Danielle's shoulder an hour later, holding a sealed manila folder the color of old secrets. The nurse's hands trembled slightly as she opened Captain Chen's military file, and when she began to read aloud, her voice caught on every word, 3 tours. For field hospitals. Classified operations in Tikrit, Fallujah, Sanjin Valley. Medical evacuations under fire. A service record that explained why a Navy captain knew who Valkyrie was, why her name tattooed in reverse on his forearm had kept him tethered to consciousness in a VA hospital bed. The nurse looked up from the file and met Danielle's eyes, and something like awe moved across her features. "He kept asking for you. Before the stroke. He was asking for you." The words hung in the hallway air like dust motes caught in fluorescent light, and Danielle felt something shift in her chest, the first crack in armor she'd spent 2 years welding shut. A Navy SEAL team leader stepped forward at 1,400 hours, his uniform pressed with the precision of men who understood the weight of ceremony. His voice carried the kind of authority that made younger officers straighten their spines, and when he began to name her decorations, he read each one as its own sentence, each pause a moment to let the words settle, Bronze Star with Valor. The room went still. 2 Purple Hearts. Silence expanded like water. And a Navy Cross for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty while commanding medical operations in Tikrit, Iraq, where you personally extracted 7 wounded sailors from a burning Humvee under sustained small arms fire and IED threat, sustaining 2 gunshot wounds and a shrapnel laceration to your dominant arm while administering emergency medical aid to all 7 personnel, 6 of whom survived to hospital evacuation due to your intervention. No one moved. No one breathed. The citation was technical, clinical, but the silence that followed it was sacred. An FBI agent appeared with papers that had begun circulating through Oak Creek Memorial's executive offices at 1,630 hours, and what he announced sent shockwaves through every administrative channel still warm with the memory of Danielle's termination. Dr. Hargrove had attempted to forge her personnel records, had doctored her credentials file to justify the termination for practicing beyond her scope, but the forgery had triggered an automated security protocol buried in the hospital's central system, a flag that had been designed specifically to catch tampering of medical records. The investigation spiraled backward from there, unraveling into deeper fraud, insurance claims at 2 previous hospitals, systematic overbilling for procedures never performed, kickback arrangements with pharmaceutical representatives. 3 separate investigations had been opened in 2 states. His competence, which had seemed so absolute in corridors and conference rooms, had been revealed as borrowed authority built on fabrication. The agent's voice was steady as he delivered the final detail: Dr. Hargrove has been arrested and is currently in custody pending federal charges. The arrest happened in the Oak Creek Memorial parking lot at 1845 hours, and news cameras were already there. Someone had tipped them off, or perhaps the universe had simply decided that the reckoning needed witnesses. Dr. Hargrove was led out of the building in street clothes, his surgical scrubs abandoned like a costume he'd been wearing all along, his hands cuffed behind his back with the kind of metal restraint that catches light in ways meant to be visible. Reporters shouted questions that tumbled over each other. Dr. Hargrove, did you forge employment records? Did you falsify patient data? Is it true you defrauded insurance companies at Memorial General in Charlotte? He tried to speak, but his attorney pulled him toward the squad car with the efficiency of someone who had seen this pattern before. The same colleagues who had laughed at his jokes in the surgical lounge watched from the ER entrance, their faces pale with the shock of proximity to scandal. The residents who had learned his cruelty as mentorship stood silent. The HR director who had signed the termination letter stood very still. The cameras flashed and flashed, and Dr. Hargrove's career collapsed in 72 hours, the same duration it had taken for the truth to surface. The ceremony at the VA hospital was scheduled for 1,400 hours on a Thursday, and Danielle stood in dress whites for the first time in 2 years, the fabric feeling like both home and exile, like a second skin she'd shed and was now being asked to inhabit again. A 3-star admiral arrived with a full-honor guard, their boots striking the tile in synchronized rhythm that sounded like order returning to chaos. The VA hospital atrium filled with 200 witnesses, veterans she had treated in field hospitals whose names remained classified, medics she had trained in techniques that lived in the space between medicine and warfare, sailors who had survived because her hands had moved faster than fear. Oak Creek Memorial's board had issued a public apology and offered reinstatement, but Danielle had declined with 2 words: not interested. She didn't want to return to a place that measured her worth by what could be documented on paper, that had been willing to discard her for saving a life. The VA had offered her something different, a position leading their surgical training program, designing curricula for the next generation of combat medics, teaching them that medicine was both science and valor. Captain Chen stood beside her in his Navy uniform, recovered well enough to wear the dress blues with the dignity that only came from having worn them through fire. His daughter stood 3 rows back, tears moving silently down her face. The admiral read the citation in a voice that seemed to fill every corner of the atrium, the words carrying weight that echoed off walls and ceiling: for extraordinary heroism and exceptional service in the face of sustained combat operations. The medal was pinned to her chest with ceremony and respect, and when the Admiral stepped back and saluted her, the entire room followed, 200 people bringing their hands up in unison, the gesture moving like a wave across the gathered. Veterans saluted. Medics saluted. Navy officers saluted. The cameras flashed and captured it all for the national news, and Danielle stood at attention, her expression controlled but her eyes finding Captain Chen's, and something like peace moved across both their faces. 2 years later, someone spotted Dr. Hargrove selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a strip mall in Charlotte, his competence revealed as borrowed authority, his network dissolved, his medical career destroyed by his own hand. Danielle kept the photograph from that ceremony in her locker at the VA, her in dress whites with the medal catching the light, Captain Chen beside her in his uniform, both their faces showing the weight of what they carried and the relief of putting it down. She trained the next generation of combat medics, teaching them that sometimes the right choice costs everything, that the mission wasn't glory, it was the person in front of you who needed your hands to be steady. She told them what her instructor once told her, what she proved twice in 2 countries, you do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. The tremor in her right hand never fully went away, but she'd learned to use it as a reminder, some things you carry forever, and that's not weakness. That's proof you were there when it mattered. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, I want to hear your story in the comments below. And if you believe that heroes don't always wear uniforms, please like this video and subscribe for more stories that prove the quiet ones are often the ones holding everything together.